The New Orleans Saints are in need of wide receiver depth, and there might be one front runner already to be the wide receiver 4, but there are some other players ready to challenge and make it interesting. We got all that and a little bit of land yap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, to all the everydayers out there for stopping by, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to keep the conversation going one-on-one with me and get Saints news, rumors, and talk delivered directly to your phone, including film studies and much more, you can head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints today. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media. You can find me as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints. You can also find me every Tuesday in the Locked On NFL podcast and here with you every single Monday through Friday and then some on Locked On Saints. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be taking a look at the wide receiver 4 position battle. We delayed our position battle conversation for a day because I was really excited to get into the Alvin Kamara of it all yesterday. So what does it take? What's needed at wide receiver 4? Where's the competition at the position? But what I want to start off with here is who I believe to be the front runner for that spot. We're also going to shout out Mark Ingram in a little bit as well with some exciting news around him. So let's get it started for today's episode. There is absolutely a front runner when it comes to the 4th wide receiver on the roster, and the front runner for that position is none other than wide receiver Bryan Edwards. I know there's a lot of folks that might put Tre'Quan Smith at number 4 and kind of assume him to be sometimes begrudgingly, and assume him to be the shoe-in to still make the roster and to still be the 4th wide receiver on the roster. But I don't think so. We took a really good look at Bryan Edwards last week or earlier this week as a guy that can make maybe as a new addition, make an unexpected impact in 2023. And I think for all of those reasons, which we'll reiterate here, he's going to be the 4th guy going into camp and potentially coming out of camp as long as things continue to go well. First of all, he's looked good during OTAs and mini camps. He has the chemistry, the connection, the familiarity with the quarterback and Derek Carr. And even though Tre'Quan Smith has the connection, the continuity, the familiarity, all of that, the chemistry with the New Orleans Saints, you have to equip your new quarterback with pieces that he's comfortable with. And I think that's part of the biggest reason that I give Bryan Edwards the biggest leg up in this competition so far. There's a couple of things that we kind of have to think about here. What are the New Orleans Saints looking for in their wide receiver 4? Do they want their wide receiver 4 or 4th wide receiver to be a guy that can come out on the field as a 4th wide receiver? Do they want that guy to simply be a backup to the X position at Michael Thomas? Do they want him to be a speedier, more shiftier backup so that they immediately back up guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed? There's a lot of different ways that the Saints can go with this, but because Bryan Edwards has experience taking snaps on the outside and in the slot and on both the strong and weak sides of the offense, because he has a diverse route tree, especially when working in an offense with the Las Vegas Raiders that is very familiar to the New Orleans Saints offense, it's hard for me to look at Bryan Edwards as anything but the favorite to be that 4th wide receiver. And as we know, I don't usually like to use wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, so on and so forth, because in game, those designations don't make sense because your go-to guy changes based on matchups and things like that. But when we're talking about a roster build, I get it. I understand it. I don't like it, but I get it. So when we look at wide receiver 4, we might be looking at a guy who is the backup or top backup to the wide receiver, to the top wide receiver, or is a guy that comes out on the field whenever they want to deploy 4 wide receiver routes, which the Saints don't do very often. But now that you've got a guy in Derek Carr that is a little bit more familiar with some of those concepts, maybe that's some of the stuff you add from the Raiders previous offensive installments that Derek Carr had run. And a guy like Bryan Edwards, who has also been in those systems before and has been in those looks before, just makes all the sense in the world that he becomes the next guy at wide receiver. Now, Bryan Edwards also has a bit more of an expansive route tree than Tre'Quan Smith. Tre'Quan being a guy that came into the NFL as an outside receiver. He was drafted as an outside receiver, but then forced into the slot in the early years and kind of had to learn the playbook. And it took time for him to learn the playbook and all these other things. And then became kind of a limited receiver player, but that could make some of those nitty gritty catches, those tough catches over the middle, things like that. Bryan Edwards has all of that as well. I mean, he's not a contested catch guy, but neither is Tre'Quan Smith, but they can make catches in tough situations. And Bryan Edwards coming through with, 30 plus reps at 6 or 7 different routes. I mean, it's hard to ignore the expansiveness of what he could potentially bring to an offense that he's more comfortable with. I know we can look at his last year with Atlanta and see that he was virtually unusable in Atlanta, or Atlanta didn't want to use him, whatever that was. But you get him into a system like the New Orleans Saints, which is very familiar to what he ran in Las Vegas. It makes a ton of sense that all of a sudden he's the guy that's most comfortable with the scheme that's put in front of everybody else that's on that roster. This is all assuming that the Saints don't go out there and find themselves another wide receiver. The supplemental draft is on its way on the 11th. Will the Saints dive into that? I mean, they haven't since 1984 when they were, getting like Von Johnson, of course, was one in 1984, and then 2 other players that they brought in that were college players committed to the USFL and all that. They used 1981. They drafted a quarterback, but that's it. But there's 2 wide receivers, including the Purdue wide receiver, as well as, of course, the Jackson State wide receiver, former Tennessee wide receiver, that they could potentially look to bring in and maybe add to the challenge here. You have to give up a draft pick next year when you do that, so I don't think the Saints will. But those guys could be opportunities. And look, if they don't get drafted, they turn into UDFAs, and then you could potentially sign them anyway. So you might as well wait and see what happens. Similarly, they could go forward and potentially make a move for Hunter Renfrow. I know that the smoke is kind of cleared over there, but will that begin to pipe back up once, training camp gets underway and roster cuts are staring everybody in the face come preseason, all of that. So for right now, I think I'm pretty comfortable in saying that Bryan Edwards is the favorite to be that next wide receiver, the 4th wide receiver, the other, inside receiver that comes in on those 4 wide receiver sets, should the Saints deploy any of those in 2023 and all that. It just makes the most sense. So who's the competition, though? I know we talked about Tre'Quan Smith, but there are some additional players out there that could potentially, or on the roster, that could potentially give Bryan Edwards a run for his money. I'll tell you my favorite competition, my favorite player that I'd love to see really push this competition and potentially knock off Bryan Edwards for that 4th wide receiver spot, at least in my mind. We'll get to that as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. This is the time to take your first swing on betting MLB action over at FanDuel, because they're going to give you 10 times your first bet amount back in bonus bets up to $200. That means that if you put down $20 on, let's say, the Braves to win or the Astros to win or something like that, you're going to get $200 back in bonus bets, whether you win or lose that bet. It does not matter. Now that's an additional $200 that you could put down on the money line, on over-unders, on who's going to score the first home run, number of strikeouts, so much stuff that you can get in on over at FanDuel, and you're going to be able to do it all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you bet and when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on all of the MLB action with the remainder of the season on the way than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Big thank you to all the everydayers out there making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll be back with you on Monday, where we're looking at some of the biggest questions surrounding the New Orleans Saints, as we continue to do over the course of the offseason. And for the subtexters out there, our exclusive Crew and A or Q&A will be out later on today. So we're taking a look at the wide receiver 4, heavy air quotes on that position for the New Orleans Saints, and the battle that will be there. I think that Bryan Edwards, former Raider, now reunited with Derek Carr here in New Orleans, is the front runner for that spot. Some would probably say Tre'Quan Smith because of his familiarity, even though they might not like that. They might say that reluctantly, whatever. I understand that argument, but I do think that Bryan Edwards' familiarity with the quarterback is a big piece of it. But I'll tell you who I think my favorite competitor is in this conversation, and it's rookie A.T. Perry. A.T. Perry, who had over 120 catches in each of the last couple of years, outstanding production at Wake Forest. He walked in as a 6th-round draft selection for the New Orleans Saints. They traded a whole player away to move up and get him. They traded Adam Troutman to the Denver Broncos. That was the pick that they used to draft A.T. Perry. You look at him as a 6'3", 6'4", 205-pound guy that struggled a little bit during mini camps and OTAs to come down with the contested catches, had some focus drops, things like that. During mini camps, we saw things progress big time for him. He took some good steps in the right direction, and that's fantastic because I think that he's maybe the top guy to compete for this spot outside of the favorite in Bryan Edwards over the course of training camp. Now, he's going to have to be able to bring down those contested catches, show that he can go up there, use that 6'3", 6'4" frame, use that leaping ability, that athleticism that he has to be able to go up there and make plays over smaller defensive backs. And of course, he's got to weed out some of the focus drops that were a big part of his scouting report and things like that. But I'm sure Coutee Burns and the New Orleans Saints offensive coaching staff are going to be able to find a way to help him out, at least with the latter. The contested catch part is just something he's got to be able to come down with. But I mean, I walk into the locker room and I see the guy and I'm like looking up like this every time. I'm looking up almost straight to the sky every time that he walks by because he is such a big dude. And I'm not super small. I'm not 6 foot. I'm like 5'11", maybe. And so like he goes by and I'm like looking up at him and you wonder like, okay, well, this guy shouldn't have any issues at all in terms of being able to go up and get it. And so you'd love to see that become more consistent. And maybe training camp is a time that happens. And I'll tell you right away, if he shows that and if he proves that during training camp and the drops come down from what we saw during OTAs, which is already a process that started during mini camps, and now if he starts to show you the contested catch opportunities and him being able to come down with some of those and everything, then I mean, it's going to be hard to keep him off the field. It's going to be hard to keep him away from being that guy, especially if he goes out there and performs during the preseason well, and it shows you what he can do on special teams, which we've already seen some positive gunner routes from him and things like that. Remember, the big thing around Emmanuel Butler years ago was that he was a big-bodied guy that can go up there and make these big plays, but there was no space for him on the roster because he couldn't get it on special teams. We're already seeing A.T. Perry cross that threshold. So I do think that A.T. Perry is a guy that we should watch in this conversation for sure and pay serious attention to in this conversation, even though he's a 6th-round rookie. The other guys that are competing here, I would throw in an additional new addition in James Washington, the former Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver. He's a little bit more of a slider frame, not really a slider frame. He's like 213. He's got a running back build, almost 5'11", 215, 213. He's basically Alvin Kamara. And then, so you look at him as being a little bit more of a field stretcher, a little bit more of a speed guy is the way that the Saints described him. And one of the reasons why they went out and got him after his visit when he came in over the course of the offseason. So, he's another player that you're watching there for sure. Of course, Tre'Quan Smith is involved in that conversation. Keith Kirkwood should absolutely be involved in that conversation. Keith Kirkwood is an interesting guy because I speak with Keith. He speaks with everybody. He's such a nice dude, like just really, really good personality. And he's becoming a leader in that wide receiver room. So whether he's on the practice squad or on the on the active roster, he's going to be a leader for that team and helping some of these young guys that we're talking about, like A.T. Perry, for instance, and of course Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed and others in terms of their adjustments to the NFL and all those things. And so I think that he's got a lot of value. I don't know that he's wide receiver 4 value, however, but I think he's got value in being on this roster in some capacity next year because of what he can do for the locker room. Then there's the two other new additions at wide receiver. Keke Coutee, who is one of these guys that comes in formerly from Texas Tech, 5'11", 180-ish pounds, a little bit undersized, a little bit underweight from what the New Orleans Saints usual prototype is at the position. Everybody else aside from Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave are over 200 pounds. And Chris Olave now is hovering around 192, 195. So he's pretty close. And then Shaq Davis, the UDFA out of South Carolina State. Shout out to the HBCUs. 6'3", 6'4", 215 pounds. Good leaping ability. Kind of has that Marcus Colston about him, kind of like A.T. Perry does as well. So both of those guys could be really intriguing this offseason if they show you that they could do more than just the deep ball. If they show you they can make the tough catches, the contested catches, things like that, then all of a sudden they're potentially challenging a Bryan Edwards for the top spot, or the top spot behind the big three. We'll say it that way. Keke's an interesting one because I know the Saints brought him in to really get a look at him as a returner in addition to Lynn Bowden. They brought both those guys in kind of with that in mind. But Keke Coutee's not a guy that you should really ignore when it comes to any of these conversations. He's not a bad receiver by any stretch of the imagination, and he's somebody that could potentially surprise. I just don't know that he is the frame of what the New Orleans Saints would be looking for as a guy that's effectively going to be your backup at the top wide receiver spot, or if you want a big body guy, things like that. So I think for him, it's like, yeah, I could see him making the roster potentially if they keep 5 wide receivers or something like that, but or 6 wide receivers even. I don't know how many wide receivers they're going to keep this year. They have a ton of these, but there's a whole bunch of opportunity for them to be able to really generate some competition here at the, I'll say this loosely, bottom of their wide receiver roster. And the reason why I say, heavy quotation marks in that, or heavily kind of caveated in that, is that, look, if the New Orleans Saints offense is what the New Orleans Saints offense has been in the past, they're spreading the ball all over the place. And that's what you want to see in 2023. And so having this type of competition down there really helps. And who knows, maybe we see more competition as well. So what is it that's going to help us split the hairs here? What is it that the New Orleans Saints are looking for in a, quote, wide receiver 4, or the guy directly behind the big 3? Let's break that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at what do the New Orleans Saints need behind their big 3 at wide receiver. And I have 3 specific things that I think you're looking for. You want a guy that's going to be able to be your backup support in case Michael Thomas deals with an injury, to where you could have another 6'3" plus type guy over on the outside to make some of those tough catches. No one's going to do it like Michael Thomas can. So the ideal situation here is that you don't have to replace Michael Thomas at any point, but you have to be prepared just in case that happens. The interesting thing here is that the Saints could go a couple of different routes in terms of how they do this. They could make that top wide receiver behind the big 3 a Michael Thomas-like receiver, which would be a big-bodied guy like a Bryan Edwards, or like an A.T. Perry, or like a Shaq Davis if he impresses. Or they could go the athleticism route and think about, okay, how do we most dynamically create an attack with Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed? And then maybe that's where another field stretcher like James Washington comes in. Maybe another possession guy like Tre'Quan Smith comes in. Maybe another, potential, another big body guy. So you have to kind of make that decision about who would you want to pair up with those guys. But you also have to be prepared for potential injuries to Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed as well. So maybe the idea here is to have Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and you have one big body guy, and then you have one field stretcher guy, and maybe you keep an additional big body guy, perhaps. I don't know if they're going to keep 5 or 6 wide receivers this year. We'll see. And they might keep 6 before week 1, and then that changes after week 2, or, how all that goes. So I think what you're looking for is somebody that's going to be able to complement the remaining receivers if they have to step into one of the big 3's roles, or doesn't force you to change the playbook. So you have to have those players back there. So Bryan Edwards and James Washington, as 2 guys with a lot of NFL experience, make a ton of sense as being the guys behind the big 3. And then if you keep a 6th, you keep A.T. Perry, you invested in him in the draft pick, all those other things. I have a hard time finding the place for Tre'Quan Smith, but maybe it's there. We'll see. Training camp, he's got to be able to prove a lot, but he's been a training camp darling before, and it hasn't been able to translate out onto the field. So that's number 1, is making sure that you have the appropriate backup that will be out there. Number 2, you have to think about who do you want behind the big 3, because you might want someone in addition to the big 3 every now and then for some 4 wide receiver sets, especially when you've got a guy like Taysom Hill that can come in at quarterback. What we've seen from the Philadelphia Eagles is that the spread offense works for the running quarterback really, really well in the NFL. And maybe that was just because we saw it last year, but maybe they got tape on it. Defenses got tape on it. They're more ready for it, but they're not ready for it from the New Orleans Saints. And so who is the guy that's going to be able to help you in that category? And that's kind of where there's a blend of 0.2 and 0.3 for me. But before I get to that blend, let's think about the receiving archetypes, right? You have the big body contested catch, can do it all for you guy in wide receiver Michael Thomas. You got Chris Olave, who is the field stretcher that could do anything for you, all 3-level of threat, not a yards after catch threat, but is an easy separator, is able to make some good catches, is working on his contested catch abilities, all that stuff too. You got another field stretcher with yards after catch ability in Rashid Shaheed. So now who do you put out there as the fourth guy that's a part of that, maybe lining up beside Michael Thomas? Do you need another athletic guy? Do you want another big-bodied guy? Do you want another, whatever it might be? And I think in that case, you want another athletic guy. Because if you wanted another big-bodied guy, you would just do a 3-wide receiver set with a tight end flexed out wide or flexed out into the slot or whatever. You don't need to have another wide receiver for that. And so maybe that's an argument in favor of guys like James Washington and Keke Coutee, and maybe even Lynn Bowden, who can play running back, wide receiver, all of that. So there's a couple of different spots where you can absolutely see them maybe leaning into a little bit more of the athletic archetype in terms of mixing things in with the 3 guys, even if they're already on the field, as a 4 wide receiver set. The final piece of that, though, especially when it comes to the running portion of it, is you also want a solid run blocker. This is the thing that kept Tre'Quan Smith on the roster for years at this point, is that he has been a solid run blocker for this team as a perimeter blocker. Last year, in terms of run blocking snaps, 213. 2 years ago, 265. His rookie year, 248. I mean, he's asked to do this quite a bit. And in each of those years, he scored pretty highly in terms of, grading metrics and things like that, which, are so unforgiving, but yet also so forgiving at the same time. I won't bog you down with those numbers, but know that he's graded positively as a guy there. In the 2 years that Bryan Edwards was with Las Vegas, though, he also graded highly. He was asked to do it 278 times in 2021, 114 times his rookie season in 2020. So you know that he's somebody that's going to be able to contribute there as well. One of the other reasons why I give the former South Carolina Gamecock a little bit of a, he's the favorite for me right now at wide receiver 4. James Washington, not as successful as the other two, and Tre'Quan Smith and Bryan Edwards. He did have a successful season doing it, but he hasn't been asked to do it over 200 times at any point in his career. So maybe that archetype doesn't necessarily fit for him. Doesn't mean that he doesn't make the roster, but maybe he's not the next guy behind the big 3. Interestingly, asked to do it quite a bit and was extremely successful at this, rookie wide receiver A.T. Perry. This is another one of the reasons why I think that A.T. Perry is my favorite to challenge the favorite in Bryan Edwards. 330 run blocking snaps last year, 334 the year before that, 123 and then 49 the 2 previous years. But man, he was outstanding there. Now, he drew 4 penalties in 2021, but not all of those came down to him in run blocking. Some of those were like offensive pass interference calls and things like that. But I mean, he was a solidly reliable perimeter blocker. Does that mean that he's going to be able to translate that to the NFL, though? NFL speed, NFL size. When it comes to DBs, you're dealing with maybe a safety or a nickel corner as opposed to a perimeter corner in this 4 wide receiver set if you're A.T. Perry, depending upon the deployment and the alignment. So does that change his effectiveness there? Was he really good at this because he was blocking the perimeter corners that aren't trying to make tackles in college and things like that? Maybe, but now you get to figure that out. So I think that those are kind of the 3 things that you're looking for. Who can step in for you and fill a gap? And this is another reason why A.T. Perry is actually a good option for me. I'm kind of talking myself into A.T. Perry as being the favorite, but got to get the catching down and figure all that out first. But if he's able to go in there, what you get from him is a big body guy. If he can show you that he can make the contested catches, okay, then he can slot in at that X receiver role, that split end role of Michael Thomas. But you also know that he's got a field stretching ability, that he can run routes, that he can do all these things. So then maybe he does also fit in if a Chris Olave, needs to take a play off or something like that. So getting back into that, my A.T. Perry hype here, but we got to wait and see what happens during training camp. For right now, Bryan Edwards is the favorite for me. But I mean, it's clear to see where a guy like A.T. Perry can absolutely challenge. So I think that's maybe the most pivotal trio when it comes to the competition at wide receiver is Bryan Edwards, Tre'Quan Smith, A.T. Perry. I'll throw Shaq Davis in there too because he's of similar build and has good speed and has similar kind of skill sets at his level at least. That's kind of the big four in terms of the battle for me there. So we'll see who comes out. But right now, if I had to rank those three players or those four players, I'd probably go for now Bryan Edwards, A.T. Perry, Tre'Quan Smith, and then Shaq Davis. Only because we haven't gotten to see much Shaq Davis yet because he's been kind of third team. So you don't get to see a lot of third team reps during OTAs and minicamp. So we just really haven't gotten an opportunity to see him much. So we'll see if maybe training camp allots him greater opportunity. Going to be a lot of fun, that battle. And y'all, we're just a couple of weeks away from training camp, which is equally very soon and not soon enough all at the same time. So I'm looking forward to continuing to get us ready for training camp as it inches closer and closer and closer. Coming up on Monday, biggest questions around the New Orleans Saints. We're continuing to answer them. Can the defensive line improve, particularly on the defensive interior when it comes to the run game? We'll discuss a little bit about what Nathan Shepard, Brian Brzee, and Colin Saunders bring to that area. And I'll give you my bold prediction at wide receiver on Monday as well. Got all that coming up for you for another episode of Locked On Saints after the weekend. Enjoy the weekend. Have a lot of fun. Please be safe. Oh, big shout out. I wanted to rep Mark Ingram too. How cool. Joining the Fox team as a college football analyst. This dude has been doing it well. And he is somebody that is such a bright, bubbly, infectious personality. I can't wait to get to see him on Saturdays and watch him with those college football games. That's going to be so much fun. And I'm super excited for him. And another New Orleans Saint moving on to a media landscape after their time here in New Orleans. And Cam Jordan will be the next to do it as well. And won't be surprised if guys like Demario Davis and Derek Carr eventually do it as well. So really, really cool stuff from Mark Ingram. Send me your favorite Mark Ingram memory. I'll share mine on Monday, but send me your favorite Mark Ingram memory during his time with the New Orleans Saints. Appreciate y'all as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.